A church filled with killers went silent. Not the respectful kind of silence, the dangerous kind. 2,000 people packed inside Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Politicians, hustlers, street bosses, Italian mobsters in tailored suits. Men who had ordered murders with a nod of their head. And standing at the front was a body. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful black gangster Harlem had ever known, dead. Then a man walked in late. No entourage, no protection, no reputation anyone respected. Just a black man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. People glanced over, then looked away. Oh, that's just Bumpy's driver, the errand boy, the nobody. The man didn't sit down. He walked straight to the casket. He placed the briefcase on the floor, opened it, and in front of every gangster in New York City he pulled out stacks of cash. Not hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. One stack, then another, 10 stacks. $100,000 in cash placed directly on the chest of a dead king. You could hear people breathing again, barely, because in that moment, something shifted. No gun was fired, no threat was spoken, but every man in that room understood the message. This wasn't grief. This was a declaration of power. And the man who just made it was someone nobody had ever taken seriously. His name was Frank Lucas. And that single moment, that one impossible act, turned a driver into a king, and rewrote the balance of power in Harlem forever. But here's the part nobody ever explains. Why did no one stop him? Why did no one touch him? Why did killers, real killers, just sit there and watch? That's what this story is really about. Before we go any further, let me say this. If you enjoy deep, cinematic stories about power, ambition, and the hidden moments that create legends and you don't hit like, subscribe, or share this video, you're basically telling YouTube you don't want more stories like this. So do me a favor, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who loves untold history, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you think Frank Lucas was a genius or just reckless. Because by the end of this story, your answer might change. Now let's rewind. Because Frank Lucas didn't start as a king. He started as something far more dangerous. Someone invisible. Chapter 1. Before Frank Lucas ever claimed a throne, before his name meant anything in Harlem, he lived in a place most powerful men never notice. The background. Frank Lucas wasn't feared. He wasn't respected. He wasn't even discussed. And that's exactly why he survived. Harlem in the 1950s and 60s was a chessboard already occupied. The Italian Mafia controlled the money, controlled the supply, controlled who ate and who starved. Black gangsters were allowed to operate, but only within limits set by white crime families. They paid taxes. They followed rules they didn't write, and if they stepped out of line, they were reminded who really owned the board. Frank Lucas saw all of this from the shadows. For 15 years, he was known as nothing more than Bumpy Johnson's driver, the man who opened doors, carried bags, ran errands, stood quietly behind the real power. Most people assumed that was all he was capable of. What they didn't realize was that Frank Lucas was watching everything. He watched how Bumpy spoke, and when he stayed silent. He watched who was allowed to speak in rooms, and who wasn't. He watched how Italians negotiated, how they threatened without raising their voices, how they collected money without ever touching drugs themselves. Frank didn't interrupt, didn't brag, didn't posture. He listened, and listening is dangerous. Bumpy Johnson understood that. Bumpy wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to prove anything. He had already survived decades in a world designed to erase men like him. And what Bumpy taught Frank wasn't how to sell drugs. He taught him how power really works. Power doesn't announce itself. Power doesn't rush. Power lets other people underestimate it. Bumpy taught Frank discipline, patience, control. While other men spent their money on cars, women, and jewelry, Frank saved. While others chased respect, Frank studied systems. While others wanted to be known, Frank learned the value of being ignored. Because when no one sees you as a threat, they never see you coming. For 15 years, Frank Lucas played his role perfectly. And because of that, when Bumpy Johnson walked into rooms filled with kings, Frank Lucas walked in unseen. But invisibility only works until the moment it's time to step forward. And that moment was coming. Because power never stays still. And when the man holding it disappears, someone always reaches for it. Power doesn't vanish when a man dies. It scatters. On July the 7th, 1968, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack and collapsed at a restaurant in Harlem. No warning, no farewell, just gone. And the moment the news spread, Harlem changed. Not on the streets, not yet, but in the minds of the people who understood what Bumpy's death really meant. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man, he was a buffer. For decades, He stood between Harlem and the Italian Mafia. He negotiated. He contained violence. He kept order. And now that buffer was gone, every power broker in New York started asking the same question at the same time. Who takes over Harlem? The Italians assumed the answer was obvious. They had the money. They had the supply. They had the history. From their perspective, Harlem wasn't a kingdom, it was a franchise. And franchises don't inherit independence. When a manager dies, Nicky Barnes thought it was his moment. Other black operators thought they were next in line. Street bosses started recruiting. Dealers started switching allegiances. Everyone was moving. Everyone except Frank Lucas. Frank didn't rush. He didn't make calls. He didn't send messages. He sat still. Because Frank understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. When power changes hands, the first man to move usually loses. The smartest move is to wait. Frank knew the funeral would be the real battlefield. Not the streets, not the corners. The funeral, because that's where everyone would be. Every rival, every enforcer, every man who believed Harlem was about to be taken. And they would all be watching each other, measuring, calculating, judging. Frank also knew how they saw him. To them, he wasn't a contender. He wasn't even a conversation. He was just the driver, the errand boy, the man who carried Bumpy's bags. And that was the mistake they all made. Because Frank Lucas didn't need permission to take power. He needed witnesses. And on the day Harlem buried its king, Frank Lucas was about to teach everyone in that room what happens when an invisible man decides to be seen. The funeral of Bumpy Johnson wasn't about grief. It was about succession. Abyssinian Baptist Church was filled beyond capacity. 2,000 people shoulder to shoulder, standing in aisles, pressed against walls. This wasn't a neighborhood gathering. This was a summit. The Italian Mafia sat in the front rows, dressed in black, calm, confident. They had ruled New York for decades. They expected Harlem to fall back into line. Behind them were black street bosses, hustlers, lieutenants, men waiting for an opening, men hoping Bumpy's death meant their rise. Every person in that church was measuring power. And then Frank Lucas walked in late. Late on purpose. He didn't rush. He didn't look around. He wore a black suit, a black tie, a black fedora, and he carried a briefcase. People noticed him for half a second, then dismissed him. That was their second mistake. Frank didn't sit down. He walked straight to the front of the church, straight to the casket. Bumpy Johnson lay still, the man who had ruled Harlem without shouting, the man who had kept order without begging. Frank placed the briefcase on the floor and opened it. Inside were stacks of $100 bills. Real money, heavy money, the kind of money you don't flash. The church went quiet. Frank reached in, pulled out one stack, $10,000. He placed it on Bumpy's chest, then another, again. And again. 10 stacks, $100,000 in cash, placed directly on the body of a dead king. No one moved, because no one understood what they were seeing yet. That money wasn't a donation. It wasn't generosity. And it wasn't madness. It was a signal. In 1968, $100,000 wasn't just wealth. It was authority. It said something every man in that room understood instantly. This man has resources. This man has discipline. This man isn't afraid to make a public move. And most importantly, this man cannot be ignored. Frank turned around. He faced the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He spoke like someone who already believed the outcome was decided. For 15 years, he said, he had worked for Bumpy Johnson, and Bumpy taught him one rule above all others. In this life, you are either somebody or you are nobody. And the only way people know you're somebody is if you show them. Frank gestured toward the casket. Bumpy Johnson was somebody. And when somebody dies, you don't let them go into the ground empty-handed. You send them off like royalty. That's what respect looks like. Then Frank did something even more dangerous. He addressed the future. He told the room he knew what they were thinking. Who would run Harlem now? Who would take control? He told them the answer wasn't sitting in the front row. It wasn't Italian. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It was him. Because Bumpy didn't leave Harlem to outsiders. He left it to the man who understood it. The room erupted. Men stood up. Voices shouted. Threats were formed but never spoken. And Frank stood still. Because here's the part most people miss. No one touched him. Not one man. Not because they respected him, but because they were confused. They couldn't tell if Frank Lucas was insane or unstoppable. They didn't know how connected he was. They didn't know how much money he really had. They didn't know what would happen if they made the wrong move in front of witnesses. Uncertainty froze them, and uncertainty is power. Frank Lucas didn't walk out of that church a king because he said he was. He walked out a king because no one dared to challenge him. But making a declaration is one thing. Surviving it, that's something else entirely. Frank Lucas walked out of Abyssinian Baptist Church alive. That alone was a victory, because in that brief walk from the pews to the street, Every man who mattered was making the same calculation. Do we kill him now, or wait? The streets outside were loud. Sirens in the distance. People arguing, speculating. Inside the cars pulling away from the church, the conversations were quieter. The Italians didn't explode in anger. They didn't issue threats. That wasn't their way. They analyze. Because from their point of view, Frank Lucas had just done something deeply disruptive. He didn't ask permission. He didn't negotiate. He didn't pay tribute. He challenged decades of control in one public moment. And yet they couldn't touch him. Not yet. Killing Frank Lucas outside a funeral, in front of politicians, community leaders, and rival crews, would have been reckless. It would have confirmed exactly what Frank implied, that outsiders were trying to take Harlem by force. And force invites resistance. Frank understood this. That's why he didn't leave quickly, didn't hide, didn't disappear. He let himself be seen, because power, once claimed publicly, must be defended calmly. That same afternoon, the phone started ringing, not with threats, with questions. Who is this man? How much money does he have? Who is backing him? No one had answers. And that scared them. Frank went home and sat quietly. No celebration, no champagne, no victory speech, just patience. Because now came the most dangerous phase of all, the pause. This is where most men die. Not in gunfights, not in ambushes, but in the days after they challenge power. When enemies decide whether to make an example of them. Frank knew the Italians wouldn't act emotionally. They would want a meeting, a sit-down. And when that call finally came, it confirmed everything Frank already knew. They weren't calling to threaten him. They were calling to evaluate him. Which meant one thing. He had passed the first test. But the next one would be harder. Because surviving a declaration is one thing. Convincing the mafia you belong at the table is another. The call came quietly. No shouting. No threats. Just an address and a time. Ralph's Restaurant in East Harlem. A place where you didn't eat unless you were connected. A place where deals were made without paperwork. And promises were enforced without witnesses. Frank leaned forward. Because if you walk into Harlem and try to take it, it won't stay quiet. But if I run it, it stays calm. Tramonti listened. Then he asked about the money. That $100,000 at the funeral. Frank didn't brag. He told the truth. He'd saved it. 15 years of discipline. No flash. No waste. Not broke now. Invested. That answer changed the room. Because that wasn't a gangster talking. That was a planner. After a long pause, Tramonti made his decision. 6 months. 6 months to prove he could control Harlem. 6 months to keep the money flowing. 6 months without chaos. If Frank succeeded, the Italians would respect his independence. If he failed, they would take everything. Frank didn't hesitate. He agreed. And when he stood up to leave, he understood something clearly. The mafia wasn't betting on his success. They were betting on his collapse. 6 months isn't much time, but Frank Lucas didn't need forever. When Frank Lucas walked in that night, the restaurant was empty. One table, one man seated at it. Carmen Tramonti, an acting boss of the Lucchese crime family. A man whose word carried more weight than most judges. Frank didn't bring bodyguards. Didn't scan the room. He sat down, because fear would have ended him before the conversation even started. Tramonti studied him for a long moment. He didn't see a king. He saw a question mark. Bumpy Johnson had an arrangement, Tramonti explained. Harlem ran itself. The Italians took their percentage. It was orderly, predictable. And now Frank Lucas was saying that arrangement was over. That was a problem. Frank didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He explained. Harlem, he said, wasn't territory. It was people. And people don't follow outsiders forever. Bumpy kept the peace because Harlem trusted him. And Harlem trusted Frank because he came from it. Tramonti asked the question that mattered. What makes you think you can hold it? He just needed to be smarter than everyone else in the room. And now the real work began. Frank Lucas didn't take over Harlem with violence. He took it over with structure. That was the difference. Most men who rise after a power vacuum make the same mistake. They rush to replace noise with louder noise. More soldiers, more guns, more bodies. Frank did the opposite. He slowed everything down. The first thing he changed wasn't the streets. It was the system. Frank didn't want partners. Partners create ambition. Ambition creates betrayal. He wanted employees. Everyone worked for a salary. No percentages. No ownership. No paths to the throne. That way, no one beneath him could ever see the full picture. Because the man who knows the whole system is the man who controls it. On the surface, Harlem looked the same. Corners still ran. Money still moved. Faces still changed. But underneath, everything was different. Frank stayed invisible. He let Nicky Barnes become the lightning rod. The name in the streets. The man everyone talked about. Nicky loved attention. Frank understood that. So he used it. Nicky got the spotlight, the reputation, the fear. Frank got the supply chain, the money, the silence. And silence is where real power lives. But Frank still had a problem. The heroin coming into Harlem was expensive and weak, controlled by middlemen, diluted, taxed at every step. Frank was paying top dollar for bottom quality product. That wasn't a gangster problem. That was a business problem. So Frank stopped thinking like a street boss and started thinking like a businessman. He cut out the middle. Instead of buying from Italian distributors, Frank went upstream. Way upstream, he traveled to Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, where the raw source of the world's opium lived. According to federal testimony and underworld accounts, Frank negotiated directly with suppliers, bypassing every traditional gatekeeper. No Italians, no Corsicans, no markups. What he got in return was something unheard of in New York. Purity. Heroin so strong it didn't need deception to sell. Heroin that spoke for itself. Frank named it Blue Magic, not because it was flashy, but because compared to everything else on the street, it felt unreal. Frank could cut it again and again, and it would still outperform the competition. Cheaper prices, higher margins, total control. Within months, Harlem changed. Dealers stopped asking questions. Rivals stopped competing. The Mafia stopped understanding. Frank Lucas wasn't loud. He didn't expand recklessly. Didn't chase Brooklyn. Didn't challenge other families. He stayed disciplined because Frank understood something Bumpy taught him long ago. The bigger you get, the more visible you become. And visibility is the enemy of survival. For a while, Frank Lucas mastered that balance. Invisible, but untouchable. And that made him the most dangerous man in Harlem. By the time the 6 months ended, no one questioned Frank Lucas anymore. Harlem was calm. Money flowed upward without interruption. Violence stayed controlled, purposeful, rare. Exactly what the Mafia wanted. Exactly what the police couldn't explain. Frank Lucas had done something few men in American crime history ever managed to do. He won, without being seen. The Italians honored their agreement. They backed off, not because they liked him, but because chaos cost money and Frank was profitable. To them, he wasn't a threat. He was a solution. That belief was Frank's greatest protection, because while everyone was watching the loud men, Frank Lucas quietly became the biggest heroin distributor on the East Coast. Blue Magic flooded Harlem, then the Bronx, then beyond. It wasn't advertised. It didn't need promotion. Users felt the difference immediately. Dealers noticed even faster. They didn't ask where it came from. They didn't care. All they knew was that, when they sold Frank's product, it moved fast. Money stacked quietly. Frank didn't touch drugs himself. Didn't handle bags. Didn't stand on corners. He sat behind desks, reviewed numbers, adjusted routes. He ran his empire like a logistics company. And that discipline created an illusion of permanence. Frank bought real estate, businesses, property in multiple states. But unlike other drug lords, he didn't celebrate. He didn't throw extravagant parties. Didn't seek celebrity. He dressed plainly, drove normal cars, until one mistake broke the spell: a fur coat. In 1971, Frank Lucas attended a Muhammad Ali fight at Madison Square Garden. Ali was a global icon. The crowd was packed with celebrities, politicians, and crime figures. Frank didn't sit in the shadows. He sat ringside, wearing a long, dark chinchilla coat, custom-made, expensive, impossible to ignore. That night, for the first time, Frank Lucas outshined the Italians. And that mattered, because among the crowd sat federal agents. Agents who knew exactly where power was supposed to sit. They looked at the front row and saw Mafia bosses dressed conservatively. Then they saw Frank, a black man in a coat that cost more than most houses. No known legitimate income, no official position, just presence. And presence raises questions. That night, law enforcement finally noticed what the underworld already knew. Someone had broken the hierarchy. From that moment on, Frank Lucas stopped being invisible. Surveillance began quietly. Phones tapped. Movements tracked. Associates watched. The problem for the authorities wasn't suspicion. It was proof. Frank had insulated himself perfectly. He never touched the product. Never handled money directly. Never spoke specifics on the phone. Every layer between him and the crime was intentional. And yet no system is flawless. What Frank built depended on loyalty. And loyalty bends under pressure. One arrest, then another. A driver talked. A courier slipped. The walls didn't fall at once. They cracked. And when the government finally moved, they moved with overwhelming force. January the 28th, 1975. Frank Lucas was arrested. Simultaneous raids across New York and New Jersey followed. Homes, apartments, warehouses. Authorities seized millions in cash, weapons, drugs. The empire that took years to build collapsed in a single morning. Frank Lucas had been untouchable, but invisibility has a shelf life, and once it expires, the fall is always fast. History loves loud men, the flashy ones, the reckless ones, the ones who burn bright and die young. Frank Lucas didn't fit that mold. He wasn't fearless. He was careful. He didn't chase glory, he chased control. And that's why his story unsettles people, because it forces an uncomfortable truth. Power doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence. Frank Lucas proved that an invisible man can take a throne without ever raising his voice, but he also proved something else. No system built on secrecy survives exposure. No empire built on control escapes consequence. The same discipline that raised him couldn't save him from being human. And in the end, Frank Lucas didn't lose to the mafia, didn't lose to rivals, didn't lose to the streets. He lost to attention, because the moment the invisible man wanted to be seen, the clock started ticking. That's the real legend of Frank Lucas. Not the king, not the outlaw, not the myth.